In the grand halls of Westminster Abbey, where kings have been crowned and history has been written in stone and song, a 6-year-old prince would steal the spotlight in the most unexpected way. What started as his mother's elegant Christmas performance would become a moment that reminded the world why the British royal family continues to captivate hearts across the globe. The December air carried a crisp bite as London prepared for another royal Christmas season. Westminster Abbey stood majestically against the winter sky, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven like ancient prayers carved in stone. Inside these hallowed walls, where monarchs had walked for nearly 1,000 years, preparations were underway for something uniquely special. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been planning this Christmas performance for months. Her vision was elegant yet accessible, traditional yet fresh. She wanted to bring together the timeless beauty of classical Christmas music with the warmth of family celebration. The Abbey's acoustics were perfect for such an endeavor, and the historical significance of the venue would add gravitas to what she hoped would become an annual tradition. The planning had begun in early autumn, when the leaves were just starting to turn golden in the palace gardens. Catherine had worked closely with the Abbey's music director, selecting pieces that would showcase both professional musicians and community choirs. She envisioned children's voices echoing through the ancient nave, their pure notes rising toward the vaulted ceiling like offerings of joy. But, as any parent knows, planning an event is one thing. Managing children during that event is quite another. And, when those children happen to be members of the royal family, with cameras capturing every moment, the stakes become considerably higher. Prince Louis had always been the wild card among the Wales children. Where Prince George showed the composed demeanor expected of a future king, and Princess Charlotte displayed a natural grace that reminded observers of her great-grandmother, Louis possessed an irrepressible energy that seemed to bounce off palace walls. At 6 years old, he was curious about everything, questioned authority with the confidence only a beloved youngest child could muster, and had an uncanny ability to find mischief in the most formal of settings. The morning of the performance dawned bright and cold. In Kensington Palace, the Wales family was preparing for what would be one of their most public appearances of the Christmas season. Catherine had chosen their outfits carefully, coordinating colors and styles that would photograph beautifully while still allowing the children to move comfortably. She understood that comfort was key to good behavior, especially for Louis. Prince William had been briefing the children on what to expect throughout the week leading up to the performance. He explained about the cameras, the importance of sitting still during the music, and the significance of the Abbey as a place of worship and history. George and Charlotte nodded solemnly, understanding their roles as young representatives of the monarchy. Louis listened with the intense concentration he reserved for things that truly interested him, asking questions that ranged from brilliant to bewildering. "Will there be singing birds, Papa?" Louis had asked during one of these briefings, his imagination perhaps inspired by fairy tales where animals joined in musical performances. "No, darling, but there will be beautiful voices that might remind you of birds," William had replied, marveling at his youngest son's ability to find magic in the mundane. As they prepared to leave for Westminster Abbey that morning, Catherine took a moment to look at her family. William was adjusting his tie with the practiced ease of someone who had been dressing for public appearances his entire life. George was helping Charlotte with her coat, showing the protective instincts that would serve him well as a future king. And Louis was spinning in circles, watching his formal outfit twirl around him, finding joy in the simple physics of movement. "Are we ready?" Catherine asked, though she knew the question was largely rhetorical. In royal life, readiness was less about feeling prepared and more about moving forward regardless of how prepared one actually felt. The drive to Westminster Abbey was filled with the usual pre-event energy. The children pressed their faces to the windows, watching London pass by in its winter glory. Christmas decorations adorned shop windows and street lamps, and early holiday shoppers hurried along the pavements with purpose. Louis provided a running commentary on everything he saw, his observations ranging from the profound to the absurd. "Look, Mama, that lady's dog is wearing a coat." "Do dogs get cold like people?" he asked, his face serious with scientific inquiry. "They can, sweetheart. That's why some people dress their pets warmly in winter," Catherine replied, grateful for questions that were easy to answer. Upon arriving at the Abbey, the family was greeted by the Dean and other officials who would be part of the evening ceremony. The children had been to Westminster Abbey before, but never for an event that their mother was organizing. There was something different about walking into the space knowing that this was, in many ways, Catherine's show. The Abbey was already bustling with activity. Sound technicians were testing microphones and adjusting speaker systems. Lighting specialists were fine-tuning the illumination to create the perfect ambience for both live audience and television cameras. Musicians were warming up in side chapels, their scales and arpeggios echoing through stone corridors that had heard such sounds for centuries. Lewis was immediately fascinated by all the behind-the-scenes activity. He wanted to understand how the microphones worked, why some lights were bright and others were dim, and whether the stone walls ever got tired of holding up the heavy roof. His questions came rapid fire, and Catherine found herself impressed once again by his curiosity and his ability to notice details that adults often overlooked. "The walls are very strong, Lewis," she explained as they walked through the nave. "They've been holding up this roof for hundreds and hundreds of years." "Before you were born, Mama?" he asked, and Catherine couldn't help but smile at his attempt to grasp such vast spans of time. "Yes, darling. Before Grandpapa was born too. Before Great-Grandmama was born. This place is very, very old." The rehearsal was scheduled to begin in the early afternoon, giving everyone time to familiarize themselves with the acoustics and timing. Catherine had insisted on this preparation, knowing that the combination of professional musicians, community choirs, and excited children would require careful coordination. As the performers began to gather, Lewis became increasingly animated. He watched the adult choir members warming up their voices, mimicking their mouth movements and trying to produce similar sounds. He observed the children's choir with particular interest, perhaps recognizing peers who, like him, were expected to behave in ways that sometimes felt at odds with their natural energy levels. The acoustics of Westminster Abbey are legendary, and, as the first full run-through began, even Lewis seemed to understand that something special was happening. The sound filled the space in a way that modern concert halls, for all their technical sophistication, could never quite replicate. Voices seemed to come from the very stones themselves, as if the building were joining in the song. Catherine watched her family during this rehearsal with a mixture of pride and maternal concern. William was clearly moved by the music, his appreciation for the arts something he had inherited from his mother. George was listening intently, his young face showing the concentration of someone trying to understand and appreciate something beautiful. Charlotte was swaying slightly to the rhythm, her natural musicality evident in her unconscious movement. And Lewis was absorbing everything with the intensity of a small scientist studying a fascinating new phenomenon. His eyes moved constantly, tracking the conductor's gestures, watching how different singers breathed, observing the way sound seemed to bounce around the ancient walls before finding its way to his ears. During a break in the rehearsal, Lewis approached one of the adult choir members with a question that would later be retold in royal circles for years to come. "Excuse me," he said with the polite formality that had been drilled into all the Wales children, "but why do you open your mouth so wide when you sing the big notes? Are you trying to catch flies?" The choir member, a distinguished soprano who had performed at Covent Garden, was so charmed by the question that she spent several minutes explaining breath support and vowel formation to an audience of one very attentive 6-year-old prince. As the afternoon progressed and the full evening's program took shape, it became clear that Catherine's vision was becoming reality. The performance would blend traditional Christmas carols with contemporary arrangements, feature both professional artists and community participants, and create an atmosphere that was both reverent and joyful. But, perhaps most importantly, it was becoming apparent that this would be an event where the formal boundaries between performers and audience, between royals and commoners, between adults and children, would blur in the most wonderful way. And, at the center of this magical dissolution of barriers was a 6-year-old boy whose natural curiosity and irrepressible personality were about to remind everyone watching that the best performances often come from the most unexpected moments. As evening approached and the invited audience began to arrive, Catherine felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that accompanied any major royal event. Everything had been planned meticulously, rehearsed thoroughly, and prepared with the attention to detail that royal protocols demanded. What she couldn't have planned for was the way her youngest son would transform the evening from a beautiful performance into an unforgettable experience that would touch hearts around the world and remind everyone why, in an age of carefully managed public images, authenticity still had the power to captivate and charm. As the winter sun set over London, Westminster Abbey transformed into something magical. Golden light from carefully positioned fixtures warmed the ancient stone, creating an atmosphere that felt both timeless and intimately welcoming. The invited audience began to take their seats, a carefully curated mix of dignitaries, community leaders, and families who had contributed to various charitable causes close to Catherine's heart. The Wales family made their entrance with the practiced grace that royal appearances required, but there was something more relaxed about this evening. Perhaps it was Catherine's vision of making this event feel more like a family gathering than a formal state function, or perhaps it was the inherent warmth that Christmas music brings to any setting. Whatever the reason, even the usually reserved British audience seemed more animated than usual. Louis walked between his parents, his small hand secure in Catherine's grasp. He had been briefed extensively on proper behavior, but his eyes were wide with wonder at seeing the Abbey filled with people and alive with anticipation. The transformation from the afternoon's rehearsal space to this evening's performance venue seemed to fascinate him almost as much as the music itself had. Their seats were in the front section, positioned to give them clear views of all the performers while ensuring that the cameras could capture the family's reactions throughout the evening. This dual purpose of royal seating, to provide both optimal viewing and optimal filming, was something the older children had grown accustomed to, but, for Louis, the presence of cameras remained a source of curiosity rather than constraint. As the evening's first performance began, a traditional rendition of O Come, All Ye Faithful, performed by the Abbey's professional choir, the audience settled into that special silence that comes when people are truly listening. The voices rose through the vaulted space with such clarity and power that even the most fidgety attendees seemed to be drawn into a state of reverent attention. Louis sat remarkably still during this opening piece, his head tilted slightly as he listened with the concentration of someone trying to understand how such beautiful sounds were being created. Catherine noticed his focus and felt a moment of maternal pride. Perhaps all those conversations about proper behavior and the importance of showing respect for performers had actually sunk in. The second piece was a more contemporary arrangement of Silent Night, performed by a community choir from East London. These were not professional singers, but their voices carried something that technical perfection sometimes lacks: genuine emotion and personal investment in the music they were sharing. Catherine had specifically chosen to include community groups because she believed that Christmas music belonged to everyone, not just trained performers. It was during this performance that Louis began to show the first signs of the behavior that would soon captivate audiences far beyond Westminster Abbey. As the choir sang the familiar opening lines, Louis began to mouth the words along with them. Not singing aloud, not disrupting the performance, but clearly trying to participate in the only way he felt was appropriate. Catherine noticed and felt her heart warm. Here was her 6-year-old son, in one of the most formal settings imaginable, finding a way to join in the joy of the music while still respecting the rules he had been taught. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful participation she had hoped this event would inspire in all its attendees. But Louis was just getting started. As the community choir reached the chorus, their voices blending in harmonies that spoke of hours of practice and genuine love for the music they were performing, Louis began to sway slightly in his seat. The movement was subtle, respectful, but unmistakably rhythmic. He was feeling the music in his whole body, not just hearing it with his ears. Prince William noticed his son's gentle swaying and caught Catherine's eye with a look that mixed amusement with mild concern. They had learned from experience that Louis's physical responses to music could escalate quickly, and, while his enthusiasm was endearing in family settings, they weren't sure how it would play in this very public venue. The third performance of the evening featured a children's choir from a local primary school, singing a medley of international Christmas songs. Catherine had chosen this group specifically because she wanted Louis, George, and Charlotte to see other children their age participating in something meaningful and beautiful. She hoped it would inspire them to think about their own potential contributions to such events. As the young voices began to sing, something remarkable happened in Louis's section of the audience. Several other children, who had been sitting with varying degrees of patience through the adult performances, began to show signs of recognition and engagement. Here were their peers, on the same stage where kings had been crowned, confidently sharing their musical gifts with an audience that included some of the most important people in Britain. Louis was transfixed. These weren't adults making music that seemed almost magical in its complexity and sophistication. These were children, some of whom looked younger than he was, standing up in front of all these people and singing with confidence and joy. His 6-year-old mind began working through the implications of what he was seeing. If other children could perform here, what was stopping him from participating too? The children's choir launched into Jingle Bells with an arrangement that encouraged audience participation during the chorus. The conductor, a young teacher who clearly understood how to work with children, made eye contact with various sections of the audience and gestured encouragingly for people to join in. This was the moment Catherine had both hoped for and slightly dreaded. She wanted the evening to feel participatory and joyful, but she also knew that once you invite audience participation at a royal event, things can take on a life of their own very quickly. The adult audience members began to sing along softly during the chorus, their voices adding a warm accompaniment to the children's clear, bright tones. The effect was magical, transforming the formal concert setting into something that felt more like a large family gathering around a piano on Christmas Eve. And then, Louis decided it was time to really join in. What happened next would be replayed on news programs around the world and shared millions of times on social media, but, for those present in Westminster Abbey that evening, it felt less like a viral moment being created and more like pure, authentic joy refusing to be contained by protocol. Louis began to sing along with Jingle Bells at full voice, his clear 6-year-old soprano rising above the gentle murmur of adult participation. But he didn't stop there. As the children's choir swayed to the rhythm, Louis began to sway too, his movements becoming more animated with each repetition of the chorus. Catherine felt her stomach drop slightly as she realized her youngest son was transitioning from audience member to unofficial performer. She glanced at William, who was watching Louis with an expression that seemed to be cycling rapidly through several emotions: surprise, concern, amusement, and something that might have been pride. But, before either parent could intervene, something wonderful happened. The children's choir on stage, led by their perceptive conductor, began to look toward Louis and smile. Rather than being disrupted by his participation, they seemed energized by it. The young teacher conducting gave Louis a subtle nod of encouragement, acknowledging his enthusiasm without calling official attention to it. This small gesture of acceptance seemed to give Louis the confidence to fully embrace the moment. His singing became stronger, his swaying became more rhythmic, and his smile became absolutely radiant. Here was a 6-year-old boy, in front of hundreds of people and television cameras, completely lost in the joy of Christmas music and utterly unself-conscious about sharing that joy with everyone around him. The effect on the audience was immediate and profound. Adults who had been maintaining proper British reserve began to smile and sway along more openly. Other children in the audience, emboldened by Louis's example, began to participate more actively. What had begun as a formal concert was transforming into something much more communal and celebratory. Catherine found herself at a crossroads that every parent recognizes, the moment when you have to decide whether to enforce rules and redirect behavior, or to let a magical moment continue unfolding even though it's not what you planned. She looked around the Abbey and saw faces filled with genuine delight, people who seemed to be experiencing something unexpectedly wonderful. She made the decision that would define the evening. She began to sing along too. Not loudly, not in a way that would draw attention away from the intended performers, but clearly and joyfully. Her participation seemed to give permission to everyone else present to let go of some of their formal reserve and embrace the communal spirit that Christmas music naturally creates. The children's choir finished Jingle Bells to enthusiastic applause, but the energy in the Abbey had shifted permanently. What followed would be less like the formal concert Catherine had originally envisioned and more like an organic celebration of music, family, and the kind of authentic moments that no amount of planning can create. As the next performance began, a beautiful rendition of The First Noel by a gospel choir from South London, Louis settled back into his seat with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully contributed to something important. But his period of relative quiet was just the calm before an even more memorable storm. The gospel choir's powerful voices and contemporary arrangement created an atmosphere of joyful worship that seemed to fill every corner of the ancient building. Their performance style was more animated than the classical presentations that had opened the evening, and their obvious love for the music they were sharing was infectious. Louis watched them with fascination, studying their hand movements, their facial expressions, and the way they seemed to feel every note in their entire bodies. Here was music as full-body experience, music as celebration, music as a form of communication that went far beyond mere words. And Lewis, with the quick learning ability that children possess, began to understand that different kinds of music called for different kinds of participation. If he was going to truly appreciate what these performers were sharing, he needed to meet their energy with energy of his own. As the gospel choir reached the climax of the first Noel, their voices soaring with a passion that seemed to make the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey vibrate with new life, Lewis reached a decision that would create one of the most beloved royal moments in recent memory. He stood up. Not in defiance, not in disruption, but in pure, irrepressible response to music that demanded movement, participation, and celebration. His small figure rising from his seat seemed to catch the light from the Abbey's chandeliers, and, for a moment, he looked less like a 6-year-old child and more like a young conductor preparing to lead an orchestra. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. This was uncharted territory even for Lewis, whose previous public appearances had been carefully managed affairs with clear expectations and boundaries. But, as she watched her son begin to clap along with the gospel choir's rhythm, she realized something important: he wasn't misbehaving. He was responding authentically to music that called for authentic response. The gospel choir, professional performers who understood the power of genuine audience engagement, spotted Lewis immediately. Their lead singer, a woman whose voice could fill concert halls without amplification, caught his eye and smiled broadly. Instead of being distracted by his participation, she seemed energized by it, her next verse delivered with even more passion as she sang directly to this enthusiastic young audience member. Lewis began to move to the rhythm, not wildly or disruptively, but with the natural grace of a child who felt music in his bones. His movements were joyful, unself-conscious, and utterly appropriate to the celebratory nature of the performance. He looked, in that moment, like every parent's dream of what their child might become when exposed to beautiful music, completely engaged, thoroughly delighted, and eager to participate in the beauty being created around him. William found himself facing one of those parenting moments that come without warning or preparation. Every instinct trained by years of royal protocol suggested he should gently guide Lewis back to his seat and encourage more restrained behavior. But every instinct honed by years of being a father suggested that interrupting this moment of pure joy would be wrong on multiple levels. The decision was made for him when he noticed the reaction of the audience around them. Instead of the scandalized whispers or disapproving looks that might have greeted such behavior in a more formal setting, he saw smiles. Genuine, warm, delighted smiles on the faces of people who seemed to be experiencing something they hadn't expected, the reminder that music, especially Christmas music, was meant to be celebrated, not just observed. An elderly woman sitting behind the royal family leaned forward slightly and whispered to her companion, "Look at that sweet boy go. That's exactly how Christmas music should make you feel." Her words were quiet, but, in the acoustic perfection of Westminster Abbey, they carried further than she intended, reaching the ears of several nearby audience members who nodded in agreement. The gospel choir finished their performance to thunderous applause, during which Lewis clapped with the enthusiasm of someone who had truly understood and appreciated what he had just experienced. As the applause died down and he settled back into his seat, his face was glowing with satisfaction and excitement. "Well done, darling," Catherine whispered to him, and her words carried no reproach, only genuine pride in his ability to find joy and share it with others. But the evening's most memorable moment was still to come. The penultimate performance was planned as the emotional climax of Catherine's carefully curated program. A combined choir featuring members from all the evening's performing groups would sing "O Holy Night" in an arrangement that showcased individual voices while building to a powerful collective crescendo. It was meant to be the moment when all the evening's separate performances came together in unified celebration. The combined choir took their positions on the temporary stage that had been constructed in the nave, nearly 50 voices ranging from the professional singers of Westminster Abbey to the enthusiastic community members from East London. As they prepared to begin, the Abbey fell into that special silence that occurs when an audience senses something significant is about to happen. The opening notes of "O Holy Night" began with a single voice, a young tenor from the Abbey choir whose clear, pure tones seemed to embody the wonder and mystery of the Christmas story. As he sang the opening verse, other voices began to join, creating layers of harmony that built slowly toward what promised to be a magnificent climax. Lewis listened with the focused attention he had shown throughout the evening, but, as the familiar melody progressed, something different began to happen. Instead of simply moving to the rhythm or mouthing the words, he began to sing along softly, his 6-year-old voice barely audible but clearly trying to match the pitch and phrasing of the professional performers. Catherine noticed first, then William, and then George and Charlotte, who looked at their younger brother with expressions of surprise and admiration. Lewis knew this song well from family Christmas celebrations and school assemblies, but hearing him try to harmonize with a professional choir revealed a musical sensitivity that his parents hadn't fully recognized before. As the song built toward its climactic moment, the phrase "O Night Divine," Lewis's soft participation suddenly became something more. Perhaps inspired by the evening's atmosphere of joyful participation, or perhaps simply caught up in the beauty of the music he was hearing and feeling, his voice began to rise. Not loudly enough to disrupt the professional performance, but clearly enough that nearby audience members began to turn and listen. His pitch was remarkably accurate for a 6-year-old, his timing showed an intuitive understanding of the music's rhythm, and his expression revealed the same deep engagement with the song's meaning that the professional performers were displaying. The conductor of the combined choir, a veteran of countless formal performances, noticed Lewis's participation and made a split-second decision that would become part of royal legend. Rather than ignoring the young prince's contribution, he subtly adjusted the arrangement's final verse to create space for audience participation, gesturing gently for others to join in if they felt moved to do so. The effect was electric. What had been a formal concert performance transformed into a community sing-along, with voices throughout the abbey joining in the familiar Christmas carol. But, at the center of this spontaneous celebration was 6-year-old Lewis, standing once again in his seat, singing with confidence and joy, his clear soprano voice somehow audible and distinct even among 50 trained singers and hundreds of audience members. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her youngest son, in this moment that seemed to capture everything she had hoped this evening would become. Here was spontaneous joy, authentic participation, and the kind of genuine connection between performers and audience that no amount of planning could guarantee. The song concluded with applause that seemed to go on forever, but it was applause with a different quality than what had greeted the earlier performances. This was applause that celebrated not just technical excellence or beautiful music, but the magical moment when formal boundaries dissolved and everyone present became part of something larger than themselves. As Lewis settled back into his seat after this final burst of participation, he looked around the abbey with the satisfaction of someone who felt he had contributed meaningfully to something important. His parents watched him with a mixture of amazement, pride, and the kind of parental recognition that comes when you suddenly see your child in a completely new light. The evening's final performance was meant to be a quiet, contemplative piece, a gentle return to formal concert atmosphere after the building energy of the previous numbers. But, as the instrumental ensemble began their arrangement of Silent Night, something unprecedented happened. Without any prompting or encouragement, audience members throughout Westminster Abbey began to hum along softly. Not singing words, not drawing attention away from the instrumental performance, but adding their voices to create a wordless accompaniment that seemed to rise from the congregation itself. And, leading this spontaneous participation, humming with perfect pitch and evident contentment, was Prince Louis, his young voice part of a community of sound that filled the ancient abbey with warmth and connection. As the final notes faded and the evening officially concluded, the audience rose in sustained applause not just for the planned performances, but for the unexpected gift of authentic community celebration that had emerged throughout the evening. People lingered in their seats, reluctant to leave the atmosphere of connection and joy that had been created. Catherine stood to address the audience, thanking the performers and acknowledging the charitable causes that the evening had supported. But her words, gracious and appropriate as they were, seemed less important than what had already been communicated through music and spontaneous participation. As the Wales family prepared to leave Westminster Abbey, walking through the same doors where monarchs had passed for nearly a millennium, Lewis was chattering excitedly about every aspect of the evening. He wanted to know if the singers had enjoyed performing, whether the building liked having so much music inside it, and when they might be able to do something like this again. "Did you have fun tonight, Lewis?" Catherine asked as they reached their car. "Oh yes, Mama," he replied with the enthusiasm that had characterized his entire evening. "I helped make the music." "Did you hear me helping?" And, indeed, everyone had heard him helping. Within hours, videos of Prince Louis's joyful participation would be shared across social media platforms worldwide. News outlets would run stories about the 6-year-old prince who reminded everyone that the best response to beautiful music is authentic joy. The evening would be remembered not just as a successful royal event, but as a moment when formal protocol gave way to genuine human connection. But, perhaps most importantly, it would be remembered as the night when a 6-year-old boy taught an abbey full of adults that sometimes the most meaningful participation comes not from following all the rules perfectly, but from responding authentically to beauty, joy, and the irresistible call of Christmas music echoing through ancient stones. As their car pulled away from Westminster Abbey, Louis pressed his face to the window for one last look at the building where he had discovered his voice as part of something larger than himself. Tomorrow, he would return to being a regular 6-year-old with homework and bedtime stories. But, tonight, in the memories of everyone who had witnessed his joyful participation, he would remain forever the young prince who reminded the world that music is meant to be celebrated, that joy is meant to be shared, and that the most authentic moments often come when we stop worrying about doing things perfectly and start focusing on doing them with genuine love.